half an hour, and then if you want to put questions in the chat, and then I think Leanne's going to help facilitate some of those questions towards the end. But I don't think it's a huge group, so I'm hoping we can have a really great chat at the end of this. So yeah, please pop those comments or questions as we go. So a little bit about me, just to sort of, I'd also, actually, before I continue, just want to also acknowledge that I'm on the country, the Bunurong country, here down in Melbourne. It's part of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and recognise and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters. So I'm the Chief Impact Officer at SmartyGrants. So SmartyGrants is part of our community, and under that umbrella we also have the Institute of Community Directors Australia. We also have Give Now and the funding centres. So there's a number of things under that umbrella. And I might just ask people to put themselves on mute. We've got a bit of background noise there. Thank you. So yeah, I've worked in the social sector for 25 years now. I've worked for a variety of not-for-profits, including Oxfam and Plan International and United Way, but I also did a stint with government as well, the Department of Employment and Workplace Relations. And I've really specialised in outcomes measurement and monitoring evaluation, and did, worked in the consulting sector as well for a number of years. So I've been on a number of not-for-profit boards. I'm currently on a drug and alcohol board at the moment, and I've got two little people in my life. So what brought me to this? So I wrote an article late last year responding to calls for more data. And I think at the same time at SmartyGrants, I'm seeing all this data flowing from grantees to grant funders. And the thing is that I don't think we need more data. I think we need to actually talk about the elephant in the room, where there's this culture of fear and perfectionism in our sector when it comes to communicating data. So I don't think we need more of the same. I think we need sort of more honest and data focus more on learning rather than performance. So I think there are some technical issues around data, but I also think, and I think many of you might agree with me, or if not, please say so. But I think we're dealing with some cultural and systemic issues, which is sort of set up in that grantee, grant funder dynamic. And, having worked in not-for-profit, I know we underreport the challenges that we face. But I also now, on the other side of the fence, working with funders, can see how over-polished data can actually erode trust. So this is why I wrote this article, and then ACTCOSS actually asked me to present, and then ACTCOSS have asked me to present to you as well. So in terms of this session, I think I'd like to sort of look at is how we balance data, transparency and context, how we overcome some of these barriers to impact measurement, and how we better communicate impact to drive learning and change. So this first piece about balancing data, transparency and context, I think I want to talk about how we make data actually useful, not just accurate, but honest and meaningful. So we're going to unpack these three ingredients that must work together. Now, there's this great quote that Caitlin Lattanzio at the World Bank says, and she's a real champion of transparency, and she has this great quote where she says, if you have data without context, you risk misinterpretation. If you have data without transparency, you risk mistrust. And if you have transparency without data, you risk storytelling without accountability. So they really are interconnected, these three elements. So let's take a look at this and start looking at this quite practically. Here's a kind of thing that many of us receive as a program manager or a leader in our organisation or a board member. And, this is sort of, it's technically correct, but we don't know what it's answering, why it matters, or what to do with it. So I think to communicate our data better, I'm going to walk you through this example of what you can do. And I think the first thing is replace jargon titles. You know, for instance, participant ratings of program responsiveness to individual needs. I mean, yuck. Let's replace that with really straightforward language like, did we meet the participants' needs? And I think turning it into a question forces us to look at the data to answer that question. So I'm a big fan of using questions for dashboards and questions for individual widgets, such as a pie chart or a bar chart or a line graph or whatever. And then the next thing is adding a bit of a what, so what, now what narrative to guide the interpretation of that graph. And then, of course, we need some context. So let's do this. So I'm going to put a line through these awful jargon titles, and we're going to put in some better things. We're going to call this one, did we meet participants' needs? Did they feel respected and safe? And are they likely to recommend us? So that's the first shift. Turn your data titles into questions, because data is only useful if it answers something. The next thing I want to do is don't just give the graph. And I think if someone gives you a graph, I'd suggest you give it back to them and say, look, can you just give me what is the data saying, why it matters, and what we should do next? So I'm going to give you an example here, and it can just be this simple. And so here, what's the data saying? Well, the majority said the program mostly met their needs, fewer said completely, and some said a little or not at all. So this is just the facts. What's it saying? And then there's a bit of a so what. So this is the interpretation. So what is that saying? It's saying, well, mostly the program is on the right track, but gaps remain for a significant minority. So, you know, there's people there that are saying not at all and a little. The now what is, well, what do we do now? You know, what should we do next? And this is really the call to action. And so really it's about exploring the unmet needs through follow-up and aiming to shift more participants to completely met as well. So I've got I've put a few more in there for the other ones here. We're not going to walk through it, but when I share the slides, you can have a look at that as well. But I think what it does is it helps you if you're being given a report, or helps the person you're giving a report to understand the data in a context and connecting it to action. And this is so important when we come to learning loops. Getting the data in, what do we do with it? How do we improve practice? Becomes part of that sort of learning loops in the organization. And as I said before, I like the dashboard to have a title as well. So really, this dashboard a good title would be, how well did we deliver the program? And then these graphs underneath with that little blurb would certainly answer that question. And that question is actually, for those who use results-based accountability, is a key question for you guys. So the next thing here about that context, and I think, it is really important that you don't just give those slides, you actually give the context of what it's all about. This program was delivered in a rural community outreach service where there are limited services for young trans people. The aim of the program was safe and affirming space who often feel unseen in mainstream services. So that particular feedback about would they recommend us, that's really, really important. And then again, the expression, no data without stories, no stories without data. If putting a story with that data or a quote from a participant will also bring all that data to life. So here we've got Alex, who's reported that they walked in expecting to feel awkward and leave early, but they stayed the whole session. People asked my pronouns, used them, and actually listened. I didn't know how much I needed that until it happened. So that's given you a whole insight into what was going on in those rooms. So why this all matters, especially this particular quote, is it's the safety and respect is coming through in that story. It's not just a nice to have, it's really, really important for that particular program. the context of what you're doing is so important in terms of what data points matter. So moving on to overcoming barriers to effective impact, we've just seen how important it is to present and interpret the data in ways that are honest and clear and connected to context. But even when organisations have data, using it effectively is still hard. So I'm going to ask you guys on the call, why do you think there are barriers to us measuring impact? Why is it difficult to do? Why doesn't it not get done well? Why, what is stopping organisations from doing impact measurement? Feel free to just, pop it in the chat and we can have a look at your answers. I see anything. Yes, I'll do a link to the article. So why is it challenging to do impact measurement? What's some of the reasons? Friction involved in collecting data. Yep. Yeah, rigid organisation metrics. People aren't numbers. Love that. Why is accountability, Karma? Why is accountability a barrier? I'm curious about that.
Hello, good morning.
Hello.
Most organizations are hesitant, especially when the information and data is not accurate. If it has been created, there is a bit of hesitancy to share with the general public or with stakeholders. And, they try and shy away from creating an impact report.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And I think you're spot on. And I think this is why I said I don't want more data. I don't want to collect more so we can all sit on it. It's not about more data, it's about the safety to share. What else have we got? Yeah, funders requesting unreasonable data that is not trauma informed. Yeah, I mean, it also, does more harm. We've got to be so careful that we do no harm with our data collection. Yes, and that's spot on, Angelica, where you've called out that shorter term projects tend to capture outcomes, and certainly those short to medium outcomes. And impact measurement requires longer term engagement. Absolutely right. You're looking at years for impact. That's right. Yanni's called that out as well. So there is some really, there's some very real constraints and barriers to impact measurement. And I think that creates a bit of a culture which sort of taints, but certainly drives the way we communicate data. So we might sort of, obfuscation, like we might hide it behind, weird titles, or we might simplify it to the point where, it becomes fairly meaningless. There are things that we do because we're caught in this system of a lot of power dynamics. So let me have a look what I had on my list here. Yeah, so you actually mentioned a lot more than I've got here, but the fear of funding consequences is incredibly real. And I say that to grant makers when I work with them now. I'm like, you've got to create an environment that is people are going to put real honest data in their reports. There isn't a huge pressure to look good and be impressive on organisations, especially when funding dollars are short. And let me move that off the screen. So, I even had a CEO say once when they realized their intake process wasn't trauma informed enough for vulnerable clients, and they actually put a really good change in place. And I said, can we share this learning with others? And the CEO said, admitting this looks like we don't know what we're doing. So, you're kind of in this situation where people aren't sharing these learners because there's this perception out there, and it's a real thing as well, that funders are rewarding success stories, not learning stories. And the fear shapes what gets reported. And as I've said, there's pressure to look good. We report everything's great, and I've reviewed reports claiming 100% of outcomes are met. And on paper, it looks amazing, but actually in reality, it raises red flags. And so this is what I'm now seeing with grant makers. is they are starting to look at that. And I had one actually say, I can't use this data because it's overly polished. Something's off. Either the program is playing it too safe or this data's been polished. Like, so on the other side now we've got this issue where the data can't be used by the people making the grants. The overuse of polished comms as well. And I think when we remove the bumps and challenges, we actually lose the chance to tell the real story and what's going on. And then this lack of psychological safety, which is what we talked about before, is teams don't want to raise concerns about what isn't working if they don't feel safe to do so. And so I think if we want authentic data, we need, authentic environments where, we can talk about what's working and what's not working. So I want to tell you a story actually about when I was working with Oxfam Australia. And the thing is that we had a program that didn't have a funder. It had what we called unrestricted dollars that was created by, we had a giving program. So people gave X amount of dollars per week. And what that did is created this pool of unrestricted money. We could do we could invest the way that was the right thing for the community. And so when I was there, I was working on the Fair Trade Coffee Project. This is sort of 20 odd years ago. And look, initially the project focused on helping smallholder farmers grow high quality beans to access global markets, trying to get a fair price for their coffee. But after the first harvest, the team found that the issue wasn't just growing good coffee, it was about getting to the market on time. And this was because the roads were washed out, the transport was unreliable, and then the buyers backed out because they weren't getting it there in a timely way. So this could have been seen as a bit of a failure, but because the funding was unrestricted, I feel like the team was able to really talk about what was going on. And instead of sort of spinning out the story, they actually started to work with transport systems and local cooperatives. So it became less about production of coffee and more about the systems and the roads and all the rest of it. So in the next harvest, the coffee actually made it to the buyers and their incomes improved. So I think the culture inside the organisation, and actually I think a lot of NGOs and service providers such as yours do actually have those conversations internally if something's not working. It just doesn't reach the funders. You sort of go, well, we'll tell them something else. Meanwhile, we'll sort out the issues and make our program better. But I think there's a lost opportunity in building trust with funders when we don't tell them the whole story. So the call to action is really, we need, and this conversation has to happen on both sides of the fence, that we need to model honesty in how we talk about impact. And I think, the worry with strengths-based, sort of at all costs, is that sometimes being too strengths-based means that we only see what's working and we miss these hard truths that we need to face. So I just think we need, be mindful that strengths-based approaches were a way of working with people. It wasn't supposed to be a reporting method. The second point I've put here is I really think as a culture, we need to sort of be more on, what did we learn, and have those conversations with funders, what we're learning, rather than talking about success and performance. And this is my other big call out is, and I say this to funders, please remove the language around achievement and performance. Instead, let's really focus on being curious and data is facts. And then finally working out what that data means, rather than it being a thing that we can blame people with. And then, of course, using that data as feedback and sort of making sure that the report is about supporting a system of reflection and adaptation rather than just, tick and flick, we've put the report out. I'm curious, what do you think about that as a sort of a call to action? Is there something there that you could do? Is there things that you've already tried? Just curious what people are thinking on the. You want to put something in the chat there? They're being very shy group. Any comments? Does anything there resonate? What do you think of bonkers?
I think this is really interesting, but I think what would prevent us from doing it is maybe fear. That maybe they will think that you're underperforming due to the KPIs that were addressed. So do you have any advice on how to like start this conversation about the change of how you maybe want to discuss these things?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think yeah, it's a progression. I think it's where we are now and where we want to be, and then inching our way along that. I think it is especially hard when grant managers change, and I also see that you've got a project officer in the department or at the organisation. So you build a relationship, you build trust with them, and then they move on, and then you've got to start again. So I think it is definitely challenging, but I think it's telling, rather than the highlights reel, I think we've got to sort of it's got to be both. We've sort of got to tell, the positive story, and then what's curious or interesting about what's happening in the service system as well. And, they might not ask for it, what have been key learnings or what's interesting, but I think you need to give it to them. I think on the other side of the fence, they need to start asking, but we need to start telling as well. And so just telling some stories about some things that have been a bit challenging and what you learned and how you overcome it. I just think, from what I'm hearing about grant managers, if they just get reports that are all perfect, they are becoming suspicious. So how do you give a report that sort of balances that, that doesn't shoot you in the foot, to be honest, but also gives a little bit of grit as well. Does that help, Vanessa?
Yes, thank you. And about the changing contract manager, that is exactly what we've experienced. We have a service agreement with the ACT government, and every 6 months our contract manager has changed, and so you spend time building that relationship and the trust and explain what we do, and then it changes again, and so that's been quite a big challenge. And do you think that's something that's worth bringing up with them as well?
Absolutely.
All
ACT governments use SmartyGrants. So they all use this product. So it's really interesting. So I do get to talk to their grants teams, and they are really curious and they want to do really good work, but the way, they're constantly moving around. And I think it's the start as you mean to go on. I mean, in some ways, when you get a new manager, it's an opportunity to say, this is what we've learned, this is the journey we're on, this is what we're working on, and be very much more on the front foot. I mean, there's such a servant master setup in our relationships. If you can try and present yourselves more as peers, because they desperately need you guys. Do you know what I mean? Like you are the ones that do the work on the ground. They desperately need your insights and your learnings to inform policy. And they can't do anything about policy or practice without your input. So I think, try and hold on to that as well. Ravi, you've got your hand up? Hi.
Yeah, Jenny, how are you? My apologies for joining a bit late.
That's
wanted
okay.
to be from the beginning, but got dragged into something. Look, from my view on this one, the real world impact is something that we always need to share in this type of scenario when it comes to the community work. That definitely adds a lot of strength on the impact and the usefulness of the whole activity. Lived experience is what I think we talk about everywhere. I think as you mentioned in the slide here, the key process indicators and all that. I think it gets too technical for a lot of people. That's what we find it. So when it comes to our Multicultural Action Network Association, when we try to help with other small networks below us, we always ask them to give their lived experience and why they seek this sort of support.
Yeah.
So that gives a bit of a strength to what then we can request for them, mainly with the grant processing and all that. And also, how do I say that the details that they give it to us, that helps us to get some quantitative value that we can add to what we are trying to give it to them.
I think that's it, isn't it? It's that mixture of stories and data. You've got to keep both. From community. I mean, community do, and you've got an important role in the sector in building capacity with your networks as well. So the data is, they say context is king. I think data is queen. I mean, I think data is so important. But yeah, both the quantitative and the qualitative are really important to funders. So I think that role you all have in sort of, upskilling yourselves like you are on calls such as this, and then sort of passing on those learnings and insights as much as you can to your networks, which is what you do. I think I've got a comment here from Yenny about philanthropic donors are much more open to talk about learnings and pivot with organisations, and that's exactly right. And government, I think, is sometimes can be a little more rigid with that, but increasingly, they know they've got to adapt. They can't keep funding things that aren't working a particular way. And I think also going to them early on, at a progress report, if there's ongoing funding, saying, look, this particular thing doesn't seem to be achieving the results we need, but these are our ideas about how we're going to pivot, and being on the front foot around a variation or something. And them seeing you more as an adaptive organisation rather than an organisation that just keeps on going. And I know that takes immense courage, it takes bravery and courage to go forth and say this could be better. And a lot of your leaders, will find that very, very hard to do. But thank you for the comments in the chat there. But yeah, it's not easy. I appreciate that. But hopefully there's some ideas there about, sharing a little bit of grit along the way to start those conversations. So in terms of communicating impact to drive change, sorry, I'm flipping my screens around because when I want to talk to you, I can't see you. So let's talk about, how we do this. And, I think communicating should be part of this change process. The ideal is that we design, implement, collect and report data, but before we sort of send it off, we have an opportunity to reflect and evaluate and learn from that data. So in terms of important moments to communicate and discuss what's worked and what hasn't, I think it's at this moment between the data collection, when you're sort of looking at it all, before the report gets written, and a chance to sort of put it in there. And you can also, where it's appropriate, you can bring funders into that conversation along with people with lived experience. And I think that's a really interesting conversation, that everybody's making sense of the data as well. And a big part in all of this is who gets to evaluate if a program's successful or not. So, your clients might say that it's very successful, but it didn't actually achieve, the KPIs that government wanted, but it might be really successful. And so, that story mustn't get lost. That story needs to be told, and having them part of that conversation, if you can facilitate that, is quite powerful. And I think also, when that gets documented and gets written into your report, there's an opportunity for others in the system to learn as well. So it's not just about this sort of, you know, closed loop between you and government, but also sharing that information and showing sector leadership as well is really, really important. There are many ways to communicate data. You know, there's the reports, there's presentations, there's infographics, you know, there's reflection sessions, yarning circles, you know, and I think thinking about the audience and the purpose, you know, what is it you want them to do with the information? You know, if you want them to change the grant program, or you want them to change a policy, or you want them to fund something differently, this is your opportunity to sort of to use it as an advocation tool, advocacy change. So let's have a quick word about dashboards and communicating impact. So this is all fuzzy, but it doesn't matter, because it's the point is that there's so many things on the screen. It's incredibly busy. And a lot of dashboards look like this. And I just don't know where to look. When I look at this, my eyes are darting all over the screen. I'm looking down, I'm looking up. I can't fixate on anything. I'm overwhelmed. And so this is what my head feels like when I look at a dashboard. So I think I'm going to give you some advice if you are doing sort of these dashboards to give to management or pass on to funders. And I was lucky enough to do some, to go to Dr. Stephanie Evergreen's academy. She has a learning academy about reporting on outcomes and impact. And she actually did a PhD on cognitive load and data visualizations. And it was actually her idea that dashboards need to answer a question. So it's worth looking up her work, and she's got a number of books out if you're interested in this. But her big takeaway was what she said: remove half the ink. So she said, you know, if you're looking at the initial dashboard, slash it in terms of the number of widgets. Make sure you've got no more than 3 to 5 widgets, you know, like little graphs or cards or information pieces. Make sure that you haven't got any additional words that don't need to be there, or lines, you know, lines in the back of the graph. All of that stuff is affecting how you read the images or read the dashboards. And also, you know, do you need a dashboard or do you need an infographic? So sometimes you actually just need a static page. It doesn't need to be dynamic. I mean, dashboards are dynamic, they change, you can click on things and things filter and update instantly, but people often don't need that. They just need to see the data. So before you go building a whole dashboard, you might just need a few visuals that you could probably do in Excel. Now, a word on platforms. There's a lot of analytics tools out there, and I think increasingly we're seeing more and more uptake. So people using Power BI or Tableau, or at SmartyGrants we have an inbuilt solution for grant managers called SmartyGrants Analytics. These tools are very, very powerful and can save a lot of time when used well. But they can also be big time sinks, and they can be overwhelming. It's very easy to fall down rabbit holes of data exploration without really gaining meaningful insights, which is why I say to people, hold on to that question. What do you want to know from the data? And let your inquiry be driven by that, and make sure that's the data that you present. And I think, you know, and I say this as working for a software company, that no analytics tool can replace an evaluation process. You still need, you know, people with monitoring and evaluation thinking. You still need a theory of change. You still need someone to do good data collection tools. And you still need people to think, you know, to design and, you know, a useful and credible report. So be very cautious when vendors claim that their software can do it all. And I would always ask about the process behind the tool. You know, what are they, you know, what is the process that's going on? There's a few impact calculators that are running around at the moment. I would just be asking, you know, what's in that black box? Like how are they measuring impact? And I think, you know, thinking about how you use those tools. I think, I always say, you wouldn't just pick up a spade and start digging up your garden and think you're going to have a beautiful garden. And I think software is the same. You need a plan on how you're going to use your software to collect data and report before you get going. So I've got another example for you. So this is an organisation in Wales, because I didn't want to pick on anyone in Australia, but we're very guilty of this as well. This is really beautiful. It's really pretty. It's been done by a designer. But I can tell you now, Stephanie Evergreen would not be a fan. One, there's a lot going on, but again, I feel quite overwhelmed, and this is my overwhelmed slide. But it's not just about that. It's actually that it doesn't actually say very much. I don't know what to take from this. Is it good? There's all these, there's support to these people. There's these staff. There's these properties owned. There's fundraising things. But is anybody actually better off? Is anybody, we've got volunteers, they've managed to do all these projects. There's a lot of volume. There's even the number of beds. So we know how many beds there are, but did anyone sleep in them? So it may tick a box in terms of accountability, but it's not giving anybody any insight. It's not inviting any learning or helping us think differently about what works. So I think there's a huge missed opportunity to create understanding or drive change. It's not that the numbers are wrong, they're not. They're just sort of floating there, that there's, the number of people supported and their average age. But when you sort of start really looking at it, we've got some project participants here, but I don't know if their lives are any better off. So just something to think about there in terms of these infographics. And as I said, funders really want to know. That's what I'm hearing a lot more about, what's working and what's not. And they are more sophisticated than we give them credit for, even if they're changing jobs every 3 months. They do know the work is complex, and they know that not every intervention is going to succeed perfectly. They definitely want the honest insight, and especially, the philanthropics. They want to know what's learning and, what's not. So I think, I've got an example where, there was a pilot program that had lower than expected uptake, and then they explained what to do and how they're going to improve it. And I heard the funder saying they really appreciated that, and that they almost wanted to fund them more because they knew they were doing good stuff. So there are, some really good examples, of those who are doing this really well, like the Paul Ramsey Foundation and the Ford Foundation. So they are doing, in Dusseldorf, that's that D, they're doing really good on this. And I can only hope that that's sort of going to drive more of the government funding as well, and asking those questions. What should we do next? And here's a nice report that I actually quite liked, where an organisation talked about what they called champagne moments. Might not be appropriate language for some organisation, but certainly things they're celebrating. But they also had this really nice one which was called fantastic failures. And so I think the brave organisations are going to step out and start talking about both. And I think I'm encouraging you to be those organisations. I think the way I'm seeing funders engage with information, they want the full picture. So in terms of just leaving you with something very, very tangible, and this is developed by the Canadian Health Services Research Foundation, I can't claim it, is the idea of a report that goes 1-3-25. Or some people say 1-2-30, which is a bit easier to remember. But the idea is that you do a 1-page summary, the concise outline of the main messages or the key takeaways, allowing readers to quickly grasp what's going on. But then you do a 3-page executive summary. So that's people who want a bit more information. And then you do the full report, and you do that sort of in-depth presentation of the evaluation findings, the methodologies, and you give that more information below the surface. So they may never ask for this, but I think you've got to, if by a way of giving it to them, then they can't say they didn't know, the things could be better off. So I quite like this one, is showing it this way, because it sort of says, your one pager is the broad audience, maybe your public, your board members, but for you, the deep divers, the funders and the evaluators, they want that full report. But your busy execs might want the 2 to 3 page summary. So that's just something to think about in terms of how you present your programs. So be awesome to have a bit more of a conversation. But I think my key takeaways from this is, don't hide the data. And don't get sucked into the performance speak, of performance indicators and success metrics. Present both the quantitative and qualitative. Present the context and the insights, the what, so what, now what. Try and make room. And I know how busy you all are juggling multiple roles and you're often part-time, but trying to make that room for reflection with all your stakeholders. And I think also your comms team as well are very much primed to gloss up your reports. So I think try and talk to them about how you're trying something different. You're trying to sort of provide a bit more nuance. And the communication is about learning rather than proving as well. So here's some information here that hopefully is useful. But I'm curious. How are you going when you're using your impact data at the moment? Are you telling the whole truth? Are you inviting learning? Are you helping others improve? Like, how are you communicating your impact at the moment? Angelica, please.
Hi, and thanks for that. I thought there was some really good nuggets of information that we can take on board and share with our colleagues internally. I'm in a research and policy role, responsible for a lot of M&E support internally in the organisation, but also collating and putting together our annual social impact report, which is challenging in itself, but we've really tried to distinguish that in addition as a companion document to our annual report, which more looks at KPIs and other type of reporting. I think a challenge in itself is the organizational culture, especially if you're a service delivery organization. A lot of our colleagues on the front line are so immersed in delivering the service, but then also reporting against KPIs that those contracts require. And so even it's been an ongoing, and it is an ongoing challenge, but also, I guess, opportunity to build that internal capability of even as something as simple as understanding what impact is, because a lot of our colleagues don't really think about it, and it's not their own fault. It's just how we deliver services. It's just churn, basically, and making sure that we're supporting clients as best as we can. So that is a challenge. And in terms of your prompts that you've got there on your slide, it's really in our impact report. Yes, it is a marketing tool for us and our executive when they go out and talk to potential new funders as well, or government or whoever it might be. And so where do you draw that line? And we often have that conversation. What data do we include this year? Because compared to last year, it might not look as good. So there's a conscious decision that we don't, for instance, do a lot of trend data, because then that might not look as good, and therefore our, the whole competitiveness in the sector, and picks up on some of those points we raised earlier in terms of do we look bad, I guess, in terms of service provision. So there's a lot of challenging, and it goes into that comms and promotion piece as well. But I will say there's also that positive aspect of supporting. We're quite a large organization, so we tend and try to support smaller community organizations that don't have M&E capability to actually upskill them and give them some tips and support of. And one way we do that is, for instance, partner when we bid for grants, for instance. So they tend to take on the more active role of community engagement or service delivery or piloting, whatever it might be, and we support them with more reporting and M&E aspects. So yeah, different strategies, I guess, but yeah, always a challenge, but always an opportunity as well.
Thanks, Angelica. It was really great to hear those insights. We're a small group, so I'm very happy for you all to sort of make a comment or ask a question. So if there's any other sort of comments or reflections on perhaps what your colleagues have said or what I've said.
Luke Lake, how do organisations learn to ask the right questions to be able to then report better what they've done?
I don't think we need to overcook it, honestly. I think it's what's working well and what could we do better. Like I think it's being curious. Like the first thing I thought when Angelica said last year was different to this year, and I'm, as an evaluator, I'm like, why? What's going on? So I think, asking those questions about what's going on, what does that mean, and what do we do now? The what, so what, now what? I think is a good frame. We use that sort of comes out of developmental evaluation, which Michael Quinn Patton wrote a book on, and it's this idea that we're constantly adapting and evolving. So there's, what's going on, what does it mean, so what, what does that data say, and then what do we do about it? And I don't think we need to overcook it too much than that. I think, I'd love to see the CEOs talk more about the complexity rather than the success of the communities they're working in as well. And I'm sure they must do. But I think it's interesting, that line, I think, Angelica, you talked about it. What's that line between promoting organisation and then this honesty of where things are at? I don't think they should be separated. I think we're all part of an ecosystem trying to create social change, and it's complex. But yeah, look, did that help about, the sorts of questions that need to be asked?
Yeah, sort of. I mean, the trouble is that people, as the lady said, people are just busy.
Yeah.
They're not thinking about, am I getting an outcome or not? They just want to help the person coming through the front door. So how do you go from that, I'm just busy, to be able to ask those questions? Well, you're saying should be asked the so what's and now what's.
Yeah.
And how do you do that in real time? I think it's complicated.
I think as individual workers, though, I reckon you do it intuitively and on the spot. Somebody comes in, you go, what's going on? What can we do to help you? What's the next action? Like you're doing it all the time with frontline people. I think as a system, I think individuals, frontliners do it really well. As a system, I don't think we're good at collecting trends. It's sort of what's going across, what's happening across a group of people, what themes are emerging. As groups, you might do it and go, we're starting to see food security as an issue, or more people are talking about this, or more people are talking about mental health. But it often gets to bursting point when we start talking about it. But how do we get those indicators out so that we can see what's happening, so we can adapt and evolve?
I have no idea.
Yeah, well, I think that's the roles of the Angelicas, who are in the monitoring and evaluation teams, who can pull this data across the organisation. And I mean, there's so many great data systems there. As I said, you've got to be wary of them. But if you're recording that information in a system, how do we record it in a way that we can learn? I've got hands up here, Nalia and Marcus. Nalia, do you want to go ahead? What's your thoughts?
Yeah, I think to start with, I think organizations, especially community organizations, have a real difficulty in changing data collection and access to more intuitive systems. So with we migrated from a system that depended on, you know, an IT company to make changes. So the more autonomous you are in changing the data you're collecting, the more easily you will get access to that data. And I think going back also to dashboards, I just found interesting why you would show that information to those who wouldn't be able to understand. I mean, I'm all for dashboards, but you know, for the data person to interpret and generate a report rather than just come up with that sort of clunky infographic or just throwing in information every now and again. So I think, yeah, using dashboards as a tool to cross information and find trends but not for everyone, because not everyone would be interested or understand the data there.
Yeah, and that's why I put it back on the people designing dashboards to make them more understandable, because I think there's a lot that can be done to make them more user-friendly and answer questions and so on. But yeah, I hear you, like they're not for everyone. Yeah, but and also that comment about the technology, that if you're stuck with a system that's not helping you, and the systems have to help you, they've got to be of service to you. So if they're not, yeah, trying to go back to the board or the executive and asking to have that looked at. Again, money, but there are some funders that are interested in funding tech. That's something to consider. Marcus, you've had your hand up.
First of all, can I say thank you for the session? It's been quite opening my eyes a little bit. As someone who's been on the edge of this for quite a number of years, I've just accepted what's come towards me. And actually, I'll quite happily put my camera on. I've just accepted what's actually come towards me without actually questioning what's behind it. So
yes.
Having loved a good infographic in the past, I will look at that through a new lens. And I think that's really exciting. What gets me is, we talk about survey fatigue, is that every time a client touches a touch point in whatever service they do, they're being asked to complete a survey. And I think we're in real danger of diluting outcomes and how we can actually handle that. Because what we find is, if the survey is too long, if you ask too many questions at the very beginning, you might only get a third of the survey completed. And I do that as well. So what are your tips around that sort of stuff?
Don't ask long surveys. Yeah, you've got to keep them really short. I think the wisdom is shorter and more often rather than longer, you know, with long gaps, you know, so checking in more regularly. So that's certainly, yeah, that's something we do hear of. But I think if giving the data back to the clients as well. So, you know, if you are surveying everyone, you know, share that information. I mean, I don't know about you, but when I see my water bill and I can see how much water everybody else is using, I find that really interesting. I think seeing where you fit, you know, and having that information come back to you is really useful. So, and also that you're going to do something with it. And I think if you're not, we have a mantra at SmartyGrants, which is called "Don't ask that bloody question," and we say it to grant makers. We say, do not put that question on your form if you're not going to use that data. Just stop it, because you're wasting everyone's time. So don't ask that question. Go through your surveys. I mean, you know, Leanne's kept this nice and short. Keep them short. Interrogate every single question and say, do we really need it? I mean, what's painful is that many of you use validated instruments and they come out of the box with 30 questions. So you kind of, you know, but is it really appropriate that you do a K10 on someone, you know, every 10 minutes? You know, like, I guess you've got to sort of look at, as you started out by saying, Marcus, is you've kind of come to accept things and not ask questions. And I really hope that after this, maybe we're asking more questions about what data we're collecting and why, what systems we're using and why, and how we're reporting that and why, you know. So I hope that sort of it's ruffled everybody up a little bit to think about. So thank you for saying that, Marcus. I think that's a good insight. We all get used to seeing what we see and don't ask why.
Yeah, thank you.
No worries. Thank you for your feedback as well. So look, thank you all for engaging and your comments and insights. And I think it's a lovely community you have here. I'm going to, and it's great for me to hear from you because I also report this back to the ACT government and other funders. So it is really lovely to hear you know, your frustrations are very real, but I think we've just got to keep going. Over to Leanne.
Great, thank you so much for that. That was really useful, and I hope everyone has gained some new knowledge about communicating data better impact. So as I mentioned before, I will be sending out the slides as well as the link to the YouTube video of this recording. I've also sent in the chat the evaluation form. It takes less than a minute, nice and brief. It will be useful to pass on. I also recommend that you register for any of our upcoming training opportunities in June, including a cultural awareness workshop, a workshop on helping shape gas prices, and an information session on reading ACT budget papers. So you can see all these event details and how to register on our website. I've popped that in the chat. Yeah, well, that's everything from me. I just want to say again, thank you to Jenny for that great presentation. If anyone has any further questions, feel free to pop them in the evaluation and I can pass them on. Great, thank you. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks all. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.